Okay, I'm going to make a series because I came out yesterday with what is the Hegelian dialectic, and in that article there were several different sources to go read from, and I guess this is my second attempt at making this video because I was reading the first part of it, and it gives you names and what their thoughts were and stuff like that, and these were like men from the 1700s. They were economists. Basically, to sum it up for you on the first part of this, they were really narcissistic. I mean, they saw themselves as gods, and they saw that they think that in order to keep our economy going, basically that the men they have to make men work hard all day long for hardly nothing. And that they had to have government-sponsored schools. Basically, they want to, even back then they were talking about it, that they wanted to dumb down the public, okay? The ones who weren't in the 1% class. They want to dumb down the public to keep hard workers, and basically they said that, they came out and said that men were lazy, and that men wouldn't inherently work unless there was a necessity for them to do so, and that men should not spend their time in books. In other words, they're saying that that their goal is to make it to where you have to work all day long for so little just to make the amount of money to survive. So that way you do not have time to put your mind and your brain into studying things and to learning. Okay, it's really, really sad, but that's basically the first part of it. And it just talks about, like, there's 3 different economists back then, and kind of like what their thoughts were on morality, on economics, how people should be treated as a whole. It's very, very boring. And I decided that when I was reading it, so now I'm going to redo this, and I'm just going to go down to the meat and potatoes of this, what we're all really talking about here lately. I'm going to read from that, and then when it starts getting really boring and back to their narcissistic thoughts, I'll pause it, and then I'll find what we really need to be talking about right now. I will post the article so that way if you want to, you can go in and you can read it yourself. But no one's going to want to sit through an hour-long video that's really extremely boring. So I'm going to read this. It's called, the title of it is called The Socialists in World Government. And yes, I'm smoking in this because it's kind of irritating and aggravating, but I do want to cover it. So here we go. The Socialists in World Government. Before going into the careers of Mises and Hayek, we must first step back and analyze the views that were competing within the Anglo-American establishment at the time of prominence. The establishment has viewed a one-world government as the long-term goal, but there have been different factions within the establishment that have argued for various ways to pursue that goal. During the time of Cecil Rhodes, one of the strongest voices for world government came from the faction group around the Socialist Fabian Society. At this point in time, it is also important to draw a distinction between the American system of national economy and the establishment's Fabian Socialist. While both systems argue for government intervention or at least government oversight of the economy, the American system sought to improve national economies and supported the power of the state to act as a positive force for humanity. The American system has always supported free education, full employment, and technological advancement, and it has always worked to make the state truly sovereign by building up the necessary infrastructure and by promoting industry and manufacturing to make it independent of foreign economic pressures or domination. The American system envisions the creation of individual national economies that work hand in hand with the people, who voice their will through representatives and democratic governments, to improve the general welfare of all people. and it says in captions, "What is the general welfare?" I guess you can click on it and read it. To read about the extraordinary but little known achievements of the traditional American system of productive common sense capitalism, see historian Anton Chekin's, last name spelled CHAITKIN''S, article, How Henry Carey and the American Nationalists Built the Modern World. And that's another link you can click on in this article and read it. In contrast to the American system that built the new nation and guided it in becoming the greatest industrial power in the world, the Fabian Society was an elitist movement that basically sought to manage the masses by offering them social programs that endeared them to the establishment-controlled state. It was more concerned with offering the minimum of wealth redistribution to keep the people satisfied, rather than emphasizing state-sponsored infrastructure improvements and scientific and technological progress on behalf of the whole nation. Okay, I'm going to stop reading here, and I want to go I heard this scenario at one time, and I'm going to go through it with you. Someone told me this. I'm trying to remember who it was. And I think it's someone I know. That's close to me. But anyways, there's this chicken, okay? And there's this guy on stage. He takes this chicken. He starts pulling all the feathers out of the chicken. You're just being violent with this chicken. I mean, just hurting it, pulling the feathers out of it, punching it, kicking it, and everything else, okay? Then he stops. And he reaches in a bag and he pulls out a handful of chicken feed. And he takes that chicken feed and he lays it in front of the chicken. The chicken calms down, he starts pecking and eating that chicken feed. Okay? Pecking, 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 eating it, eating. Instead of running off or trying to get away, he continues to stay there eating that chicken feed. So he starts pulling more feathers out of this chicken. And pulling them out, and pulling them out, and pulling them out. Well, the chicken had already ate the chicken feed. But he was just sitting there as he's pulling all his feathers out. He reaches in there again and he grabs a handful of chicken feed and he lays that chicken feed in front of that chicken. Chicken doesn't run off. Chicken just keeps eating that chicken feed. Okay? This is one of the things that I myself came to the conclusion as. Now that I'm awake and I know what's going on and I see the arrogance of these people, that they're really like narcissists, arrogant, what I would put in the category of a sociopath. Now, I'm not a psychiatrist, and I can't really say that's what they are, but I know I can say that they're arrogant, narcissist assholes. I can say that. Who think they're gods, and they're not. Now that I know all this stuff, this is kind of what I feel like. I've stated this before in one of my other videos. I kind of feel like we all live as human beings, okay, that work hard every day just to make it. That we are living, it's like being in a zoo, like the animals in the zoo. You see them and they're beautiful and everything else, but they just have this sad look on their face. They're depressed, okay? Then we wonder why so many people are on these medications that they're on for depression and anxiety. We are living in our own enclosures. We may not be able to see them, and we may be able to travel around, you know, or inside our enclosure, but it's not something you can see, but it's there. Okay? So I completely understand when people need help. They need to go out and get help if they need it. Okay? But this is what I don't understand. Okay? This is what really gets to me. Is we have veterans, okay, and we have homeless people living out on the streets. I saw one the other day, and I had no money on me, but if I would have had money on me at the time, if I would have had money, I would have gave this veteran money, okay? I saw him sitting there, and you could tell the people who are trying to take your money and stuff like that. This man didn't have nothing to drink. He didn't have cigarettes. He didn't have nothing. He had a sign. And you could tell he'd been out on the street for a while. And I dropped my head and almost started crying. That's how bad I felt. These people who truly need help cannot go and get food stamps because they don't have an address. And you say, well, they don't have a refrigerator either. Well, you know what? They could still go into a store and get a sandwich. They could still go into a store and get something to drink. Okay? To me, that really pisses me off. But then people would say, well, that would just encourage them to be homeless. Who wants to be homeless? Who wants to live out in the cold winter? Who wants to do that? Nobody. If they had a choice to have somewhere to live or live on the street, the majority of them would not want to be living on the streets. Okay? It's dangerous. You know, it's just, I don't know. That's just one thing that really makes me mad, is that people who have a house or an apartment can go get money from the government and can go get food stamps, but these people cannot. And they've risked their lives for us at one point. Yeah, some of them might be alcoholics, okay? My grandfather, I've went through that before. He was in World War II and he was captured by the Japanese. When he came back, he became an alcoholic, okay? Most men that have PTSD cannot deal with it. Okay, they come home and they go through all this stuff and it's really hard for them to deal with what they're dealing with. Or they go and they put them on all these psychotropic drugs thinking that makes it better. It doesn't make it better, it makes it worse. Okay. But I'm going to keep reading here. I just wanted to stop, and I'm going to stop every now and again and add my thoughts and my commentary into this. So I'm going to pause now for a minute and then I'll continue. Okay. Whether you're on these programs or not, you know, I'm not judging anybody, but I want to, when you watch this video, to understand that the people that are behind these programs that they created in the beginning, I don't know about now, but in the beginning, it was not planned to help you. It was a plan to keep you stuck where you are. To keep you in your enclosure and to never be able to get out of it, because you start to depend on it instead of you depend on the state instead of depending on yourself or your husband or your family. That, just from reading this, and now I will post this so you can read it yourself. Okay, just know that right there is part of their plan. Now, I'm going to keep reading here. The Fabian Society was founded in 1884 by Sidney and Beatrice Webb, George Bernard Shaw, and others, and it quickly became a major force in British politics. In 1895, the Fabians founded the London School of Economics to promote their brand of socialism, but in the following years, the influential economist John Maynard Keynes and the Cambridge School became more outspoken in its advocacy of socialism than the LSE. After the economic catastrophe of the Great Depression, the LSE moved even further to the right, becoming the base for the main opponents of Keynes, his last name is spelled Keynes, and of socialism, as we will soon see. The LSE was always a tool of the establishment, then it was the firm bastion of socialism. The socialist faction of British politics was a faction of the establishment that was more influential in the early 1900s, and it was the primary force backing socialism in Europe and Bolshevism in Russia, with help from the RIIA and Wall Street. A historian, Anthony Sutton, makes clear in Wall Street and the Bolsheviks' revolution. The Fabian goal of a world government is highlighted in the famous stained glass window ordered by Shaw that once adorned the Beatrice Webb house. The shield depicts a wolf in sheep's clothing, while two men hammer away at the world to remold it nearer to the heart's desire. And I guess I'll post this picture in the comment section too so you guys can see it. Despite the rise in public support for socialism, which accumulated in the British parliamentary elections of 1945, the establishment became disillusioned with the long-term potential of using socialism to conquer the world, and support for the slow-moving Fabians waned. The decline of Fabian influence is typified by two members of the Fabian Socialists who, for very different reasons, left the organization to pursue other paths. These two men are H.G. Wells and George Orwell. H.G. Wells is a celebrated English author who wrote The Time Machine, The Invisible Man, and War of the Worlds. He is called by some the father of modern science fiction, but what is less well known is that he was also a passionate advocate for an Anglo-Saxon dominated world. He summed up his vision in the publication entitled The Open Conspiracy, Blueprints for a World Revolution in 1928, to which Fabian member Bertrand Russell responded, "I do not know of anything with which I agree more entirely." In 1940, Wells followed up The Open Conspiracy with an even more blunt proposal in his book simply titled The New World Order. Wells had joined the Fabian Society in 1903 but left it after becoming disillusioned with the organization and falling out with George Bernard Shaw, who then had Wells depicted in the Fabian window thumbing his nose far left. Wells favored a much more aggressive approach to achieve a new world order than the Fabians, and one of his many publications he wrote, "The men of the new republic will not be squeamish either in facing or inflicting death. They will have an ideal that will make killing worthwhile. Like Abraham, they will have the faith to kill, and they will have no superstitions about death. They will hold, I anticipate, that a certain portion of the population exists only on a sufferance, out of the pity and patience, and on the understanding that they will not prognate, and I do not foresee any reason to suppose that they will hesitate to kill when that sufferance is abused. All such killings will be done with an opiate. If deterrent punishments are used at all in the code of the future, the deterrent will neither be death nor mutilation of the body, but good scientifically caused pain. The prediction above should serve to remind the reader of the warnings implicit in the work of George Orwell in 1984. Orwell was a Fabian socialist who became critical of the movement after Sidney and Beatrice Webb toured Stalinist Russia with George Bernard Shaw in the early 30s. Coming back with a glowing report, Orwell's hatred of communism became complete during the Spanish Civil War, when he fought alongside the socialists against Franco and witnessed firsthand how the socialists were betrayed and destroyed from within by the Stalinists. In the pages of 1984, Orwell predicted that the New World Order would be led by a political party known as INGSOC, I-N-G-S-O-C, meaning English socialism, along the totalitarian lines envisioned by Wells and applauded by the Fabians who looked up to Stalin. Some commenters believe that the very title 1984 is meant to point towards the 100th anniversary of the 1884 founding of the Fabian Society, and the narrative of 1984 begins precisely on April 4th, which was the date of publication of the Fabian Society's very first pamphlet, Why Are the Many Poor? Orwell remained a committed socialist his whole life, but he became disillusioned with the Fabian Society because of its elitist overtones. totalitarian tendencies and the lack of democratic ideals, H.G. Wells also remained a committed socialist, but only in the sense that he saw the need for his own world superstate to parcel out the minimum of necessities to the masses. He broke with the Fabians because for him they were too slow in achieving their goal and too naive in working within the democratic process to the extent they even did. In judging these two cases, it becomes clear that the Anglo-American establishment reacted towards the socialist movement as their promoter H.G. Wells did. International socialism, comparable to the Nazis' National Socialism, has always been viewed as a long-term and final goal, and the elite have always intended to take care of mankind's basic necessities once they are in power and once they have culled the herd to its desired numbers, but the primary and immediate goal has always been power and control. Rather than work through state-sponsored socialism to gain control, which could be interrupted by ever-present threat of democracy, the establishment decided instead to work around the state, to utilize laissez-faire capitalism to destroy the state, and to, as Rhodes put it, gradually absorb the wealth of the world. Once deciding on this strategy, Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich A. Hayek were employed to help carry it out. Now I'm going to, after that part, it goes into and explains who Hayek is and some of these other people and what their background was, where they went to college, and all this stuff. So I scroll down and on reading, and there was a name that everybody knows. So I'm going to read from this section. This talks about David Rockefeller. Okay? And I'm going to read this above him. Okay? So we can kind of go into this. It says, no doubt an American or English fascist system would greatly differ from the Italian or German model. No doubt if the transition were effected without violence, we might expect to get the better type of leader. And if I had to live under a fascist regime, I have no doubt that I would rather live under one run by an Englishman or American than under one run by anyone else. Hayek's wish for a fascist system to get the better type of leader was an attack aimed directly at FDR. Roosevelt was hardly a totalitarian, but he was hated because he used the government and intervened into the free market to improve the general welfare of the people. Another Austrian economist, Joseph Schumpeter, who was hired by the establishment to teach economics at Harvard in 1935, had this to say when he asked by an inquisitive woman if he would vote for FDR. His response was this: my dear lady, if Hitler runs for president and Stalin for vice president, I shall be happy to vote for that ticket against Roosevelt. In his memoirs, David Rockefeller fondly recalls his years at Harvard studying under Professor Schumpeter and other professors of a similar outlook. From them it can be seen quite clearly that Harvard had also become a bastion of laissez-faire economic theory at the time when the general public felt quite the opposite about allowing big business to operate unchecked, Rockefeller writes. I was most influenced that year by Joseph Schumpeter. In fact, one of the intellectual high points of my graduate work was his basic course in economic theory. Schumpeter was already considered one of the world's premier economists. He had been active in politics in Austria and had served briefly as a minister of finance in 1919. He had also run a private bank in Vienna for a time in the 1920s. He arrived at Harvard in 1932, taking over Tausig's post in 1935, and was in his mid-50s when I met him in the fall of 1936. Schumpeter was most interested in the entrepreneur's role in the process of economic development, and by the mid-1930s he had emerged as one of the principal champions of the neoclassical economic tradition. Professor Gottfried von Haber's course on international trade also influenced me greatly. A charming man with a courteous European manners, Professor von Hebler had just arrived on campus the fall of a reputation as a staunch defender of free trade. His ideas were ignored in the 1930s when nations around the world gave in to the siren song of protectionism, but they would have a great impact after World War II when international trade expanded and world economic growth surged dramatically. Professor Edward S. Mason's equally interesting course covered the nascent area of international economic development. His pioneering work would make him one of the leading proponents of foreign economic assistance in the years after World War II, a subject that would engage me deeply as I became involved with Latin America and Africa later in my career, to the great detriment of those regions. David Rockefeller then goes on to describe his decision to attend the London School of Economics and how the way was paved for him through his family's generous grants to the institution, from the Laura Spelman Rockefeller Memorial and for the Rockefeller Foundation. He also mentions his father's friendship with Sir William Beveridge, who was the director of the LSE and who provided accommodations for David only a short walk away from the university. While enrolled at the LSE, the young David Rockefeller was personally tutored in economics by none other than Professor Friedrich A. Hayek. Rockefeller explains, "The economists at LSE were much more conservative than the rest of the faculty. In fact, its economics comprised a major center of opposition in England to King's and his Cambridge School of Interventionist Economics. My tutor that year was Friedrich von Hayek, the noted Austrian economist who in 1974 would receive the Nobel Prize for work he had done in the 1920s and 1930s on money, the business cycle, and capital theory. Like Schumpeter, Hayek placed his trust in the market, believing that over time, even with its many imperfections, it provided the most reliable means to distribute resources efficiently and to ensure sound economic growth. Hayek also believed that government should play a critical role as a rule maker and an umpire and guarantor of a just and equitable social order, rather than the owner of economic resources for the arbiter of markets. Hayek was in his late 30s when I first met him. Indisputably brilliant, he lacked Schumpeter's spark and charisma. Nevertheless, I found him myself largely in agreement with his basic economic philosophy." After spending a year under the care of Hayek at the LSE, David Rockefeller had to make a choice as to where he would finish his college education. It was not a hard choice to make. After a year in London, I was eager to return to the United States to complete my graduate work at the University of Chicago, which boasted one of the premier economic faculties in the world, including such luminaries as Frank Knight, Jacob Vineyard, George Stigler, Henry Schultz, and Paul Douglas. I had heard Knight lecture at the LSE and found his more philosophical approach to economics quite compelling. Lionel Robbins knew Knight well and urged me to study with him. The fact that grandfather had helped found the university played a distinct secondary role in my choice. So finally we arrive at the truth. The University of Chicago, founded by John D. Rockefeller Sr., should be aptly named the University of Rockefeller, and the Chicago School of Laissez-faire Economics should be more aptly named the Rockefeller School of How to Neutralize Governments and Sidestep Democracy so as to exploit the people, plunder the resources, and absorb the wealth of the world, thereby destroying the nation-state and paving the way for a totalitarian New World Order, all done under the guise of conservatism, of course, and in the name of economic freedom and liberty. In his memoirs, after Rockefeller mentions his enrollment at the grandfather's university, he tearfully laments the negative reputation that the school had gained over the decades, and then shamelessly shifts the blame to his family de facto employee, Milton Friedman. The Chicago School of Economics has gained a great deal of fame and not a little notoriety over the past 50 years for its unwavering advocacy of the market and strong support for monetarism. These ideas are intimately associated with Milton Friedman, whose views have now come to symbolize a Chicago school that is strongly doctrinaire in its insistence that government should not interfere at all with the market and the natural pricing mechanism. Friedman also argues that business should concentrate exclusively on optimizing profits and should not be sidetracked by involvement in outside activities that are socially responsible. While Friedman later became an associate of Professor Knight and Viner on the economic faculty, I have no doubt they would have resisted being categorized as members of the Chicago School in the narrow present-day meaning of the term. They both favored the invisible hand of the market, other government intervention as the best means to sustain economic growth, but I believe they would have objected to Friedman's cavalier dismal of corporate social responsibility. Jacob Vineyard, the professor of economic theory at the University of Chicago, as it may be recalled from Part 4, was the man who led the economic group of the CFR's War and Peace Studies project that was itself funded by the Rockefeller Foundation. Vineyard was also the originator of the concept that led to the creation of the IMF and the World Bank, and he played a pivotal role for the CFR at Bretton Woods. When Vineyard left Chicago for Princeton in 1946, Milton Friedman took his position and became the voice of the Chicago School. According to his memoirs, while at the University of Chicago, young Rockefeller was able to enlist Vineyard, along with the influential New Deal basher Frank Knight, as members of his personal thesis committee to aid him in writing his dissertation. About the same time Rockefeller was working on his thesis back in London, Friedrich Hayek was creating an organization that would later reform the most purulent society. The early group was formed in 1939 and was known as the Society for the Renovation of Liberalism. Members of the organization include Frank Knight and Henry Simmons of the University of Chicago, the slavishly pro-British American Fabian Socialist Walter Lipton, the philosopher of Sir Karl Popper, Sir John Clapham of the Bank of England, and of course Ludwig von Mises. All of these early members of Hayek's group then met at Montpellier, Switzerland, to form the influential, highly secretive, and elitist Montpellier Society in 1947, the world's first international free market association. Its founding members also included the young Milton Friedman, Otto von Habsburg, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, and Max von Thurin